Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about module Urban Growth in Developing Countries from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the growth of urban population, its issues and challenges. Hence, this module aims to throw light on the growth of urban population, urbanization and economic growth, main issues of urban growth, urbanization and inequality in income, urbanization and slum population, urban environment and climate change, and the livability in urban areas. Widespread urbanization is a recent phenomenon. In 1900, just 15% of world's population lived in cities. The 20th century transformed this picture as the pace of urban population growth accelerated very rapidly in about 1950. 64 years later, it is estimated that half of the world's people live in cities. This is expected to reach 75% by 2050. 95% of this urban expansion is projected to take place in the developing world. By 2030, the towns and cities of the developing world will make up 80% of urban humanity. Though urbanization in developing countries is also associated with increasing poverty and slum population, yet it is also a fact that no country has been able to industrialize itself without urbanization. In this respect, if cities concentrate poverty, they also represent the best hopes of escaping it. The potential benefit of urbanization far outweigh the disadvantages. The real challenge is in learning how to exploit its possibilities. In this perspective, present chapter would focus upon the urban growth and the problems associated with it. The growth of urban population. According to United Nations statistics, the world's population almost doubled in the last 4 decades, reaching 7 billion in 2010, increasing from 3.69 billion in 1970. This population growth is concentrated in developing countries, particularly in the urban areas. In fact, urban population of developing countries quadrupled from 680 million in 1970 to 2.56 billion in 2010. And this suggests that over the last 40 years, approximately 2/3 of the world population growth had occurred in the area. This explosive growth in world population is thus closely tied to rapid urbanization in developing countries, a trend that is expected to continue. In 1970, 18.4% of world's population lived in urban areas of developing countries. This grew to 37% in 2010. UN predicts that in 2050, more than a half of the world's population, that is 5.19 billion, which is 56.7% of estimated 9.15 billion, will be living in the cities of developing countries. This means that over the next 40 years, the urban population in such areas will grow by roughly 5.5 million a month, which is just like a new Paris metropolitan area, which has a population of 10.4 1.41 million in 2009, according to UN statistics, is being created every 2 months. Here, it is important to note that the real growth of urban population does not lie in increasing growth rates, but the absolute size of increments, especially in Asia and Africa. The fact is, the overall growth rate of urban growth has consistently declined in most world regions. Still, the annual rate of change of the urban population is highest in Africa, followed by Asia. On the other hand, the rate of change of urban population has fallen below 1% in case of Europe and is close to 1% in case of North America. This suggests that although the growth of urban population up to the middle of the 21st century would be declining, but the major contribution of absolute increase in urban population would be made by the developing regions of Africa and Asia. Another important feature of the urban growth over the last 30 years, although the population residing in megacities, which are having a population of 10 million or more people, is growing, but still a major proportion of population live in small-sized cities. Today's 3.6 billion urban dwellers are distributed unevenly among urban settlements of different sizes. In discussing urbanization, the focus often is on large cities. Cities whose populations are larger than those of many countries. In 2011, 23 urban agglomerations qualified as megacities because they had at least 10 million inhabitants. Despite their visibility and dynamism, megacities account for a small though increasing proportion of the world urban population, which is 9.9% in 2011 and 13.6% in 2025. At the same time, over half of the urban population lives and will continue to live in small urban centers with fewer than 500,000 inhabitants. The table shows that although the proportion of population living in megacities was higher in the developed regions of the world in 1970 and 2011, but it is expected that by 2025, a greater share of the population living in currently less developed economies would be a little higher than that of the developed regions. However, the proportion of population living in smaller cities would still be greater, though it is expected that it will decline from 52.8% in 2011 to 46.5% in 2025 in the developed region of the world and from 50.2% to 41.1% for the less developed regions. Thus, a major proportion of urban population would be living in the small-sized cities only. This has an important policy implication for the urban governance, which mainly has its focus on creation of the world-class infrastructure in the megacities. Of course, if the business is the priority area of the national governments, the megacities would grab greater amount of public resources. But if the welfare of the majority of the population is the main issue, the resources have to be diverted to the small-sized cities. Urbanization and economic growth. Urban economies are mainly the non-agricultural economies. The economic theory has also pointed out concentration of more productive, modern and commercialized sector in the urban centers. Higher productivity in urban areas not only shows their higher share in GDP, but also centers for resource mobilization for further investment. The expansion of cities has the potential for further growth and poverty reduction across many emerging markets. Urbanization will be one of the century's biggest drivers of global economic growth. In many countries of the world, cities serve as economic centers for whole of the country. In Asia, for example, 42% of the population lived in urban areas in 2008. However, these areas produced about 84% of Asia's goods and services. The development of modern industry requires both economies of scale and economies of agglomeration. So, on one hand, this trend should be welcomed from the view of economic development strategy, since it is a necessary component of economic growth and poverty reduction in the developing countries. It is therefore obvious that cities are the critical aspect of developing countries in terms of their concentration of both population and economic activity. It is also clear that future development depends on maximization of the benefits of urbanization to bring sound urban growth. These benefits include the revitalization of urban economies, which boosts national economic development as a whole. The figure shows that North and Central Asia and Pacific have the highest rate of urbanization as well as the urban share of GDP. However, the largest gap in the urban share in GDP and total population can be observed in case of East and Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. In the East and Northeast subregion, where 47% of the population now reside in urban areas, the share of urban areas in GDP is as high as 86%. The subregion includes the two largest trillion-dollar economies in the whole Asia-Pacific region, that is China and Japan. The GDP in this region has grown by 5.3% in 2007, which fell to 3.4% in 2008, but was at 8% in 2011. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, about 47% of total population live in urban areas, generating about 80% of GDP. It is being assumed that a major proportion of contribution of cities in world GDP would be by the emerging markets. In an interesting study by McKinsey Global Institute of 600 largest cities ranked on basis of their contribution in world GDP states that a fifth of the world's population resides in these cities, which generate 60% of global GDP. It is expected that in 2025, again 60% of the GDP would be contributed by 600 cities. But cities would not be the same. In 2025, a big majority of these cities would be located in the developing world. Today, major urban areas in developed regions are without doubt economic giants. The 380 developed regions in the cities, the 380 developed region cities in the top 600 by GDP accounted for 50% of global GDP in 2007, with more than 20% of global GDP coming from 190 North American cities alone. The 220 largest cities in the developing regions contributed another 10%. China's cities generated 4% and Latin America's largest cities another 4%. Across all regions, 23 megacities, that is the metropolitan areas with 10 million or more inhabitants, generated 14% of global GDP in 2007. Over the next 15 years, the makeup of the group of top 600 cities will change as the center of gravity of the urban world moves south and even more decisively towards east. By 2025, it is expected that 136 new cities would enter the top 600, all of them from the developing world, and overwhelmingly, that is 100 new cities will be from China. The MGI report found that for the past 15 years, contrary to the common perception, megacities have not been driving global growth. In fact, many have not grown faster than their host economies, and it is expected that this trend would continue in future. It is estimated that today's 23 megacities will contribute just over 10% of global growth to 2025, below their 14% share of global GDP today. On the other hand, it is expected that the emerging market mega and middleweight cities together, that is 423 of them, which are included in the largest 600 cities today, are expected to contribute more than 45% of global growth from 2007 to 2025. Across the world, 407 emerging market middleweights would be contributing nearly 40% of global growth, more than the developed world and developing region megacities put together. Further, it is estimated that by 2025, the combined contribution of the top 600 cities to world GDP would increase by $34 trillion in 2025, contributing more than 60% to world GDP growth and thus driving the global growth. This growth would be fueled by both the GDP per capita as well as population growth. This can be observed from figure 4. The figure shows that the share of top 600 cities in world GDP is expected to grow from 54% in 2007 to 58% in 2025, while their share in world population is expected to grow from 20% to 25%. This means that the GDP by these cities would be growing by 4.3% per annum, which is further decomposed into 1.6% per annum growth of population and 2.7% per annum growth of per capita GDP in these cities. Now let us discuss the main issues of urban growth. The unprecedented urban growth taking place in developing countries reflects the hopes and aspirations of millions of new urbanites. Cities have enormous potential for improving people's lives, but inadequate urban management, often based on inaccurate perceptions and information, can turn opportunity into disaster. Generally, rural settlements are considered to be the epicenter of poverty and human suffering. All measures of poverty, whether based on income, consumption, or expenditure, show that rural poverty is generally deeper and more widespread than in cities, and urban centers on the whole are expected to offer better access to health, education, basic infrastructure, information, knowledge, and opportunity. Poverty, however, is now increasing more rapidly in urban areas than in rural areas, but has received far less attention. Aggregate statistics hide deep inequalities and gloss over concentrations of harsh poverty within cities. Most assessments actually underestimate the scale and depth of urban poverty. Hundreds of millions live in poverty in the cities of low and middle income nations, and their numbers are sure to swell in coming years. Urban mismanagement often squanders urban advantages and the urban potential for poverty reduction. Unmanaged or inefficiently managed urban growth often leads to inequalities in income, jobs, housing, and other environmental problems. Let us discuss these problems one by one. Let us first discuss about urbanization and inequality in income. Urbanization has some positive aspects, including stimulation of economic activities, revitalization of social cultural reform, and contribution to economic social development, not only of the cities themselves, but also of the nation as a whole. However, if central and regional governments do not intervene with appropriate policies, these benefits will be unevenly distributed among certain groups rather than reaching all the people who live and work in the cities. This may result in social inequity where the socially vulnerable, for example low income groups, bear the most of the negative impacts of urbanization and rarely enjoy the benefits. Inequality levels have risen since the 1980s, especially in transition and some emerging economies of the developing world. At the global level, on average, the most egalitarian societies in the world are located in Eastern Europe. In the developing world, on the other hand, income inequalities in cities are generally high, with some regions, notably Latin America and Africa, exhibiting exceptionally high levels of urban inequality. Figure but 6 the regional averages may not show the country-wise differences. If we simply look at the Asian region, which has exhibited a very low level of inequality as compared to African and Latin American cities, wide variations can be observed in case of Gini coefficients, which is a measure of income inequality. Figure 6 shows that within exception of China, in all the countries in Asian region, the urban inequalities are higher than those observed by the rural areas. In Nepal, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Philippines, and Vietnam, these are even higher than the international alert line. The international alert line is defined by UN Habitat as having a Gini coefficient value of 0.4, above which inequalities have negative social, economic, and political consequences. The next issue is that of urbanization and slum population. The inequalities in urban areas and unmanaged growth of urban settlements often results into inequalities in distribution of urban land. The housing stock and the tenure arrangements out of which the richer ones are always in an advantageous position while the poor live in unhealthy living conditions. Poverty, begging, and homelessness have been part of the urban scene. Poor people are for the most part consigned to socially segregated areas, generally called slums. Over 90% of the slum dwellers today are in the developing world. South Asia has the largest share, followed by Eastern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. China and India together have 37% of world's slums. In Sub-Saharan Africa, urbanization has become virtually synonymous with slum growth. 72% of the region's urban population lives under slum conditions, compared to 56% in South Asia. The slum population of sub-Saharan Africa almost doubled in 15 years, reaching nearly 200 million in 2005. Figure 7 shows the percentage of slum population in different regions of the world. In Asia and Pacific alone, in 2009, 30% or half a billion urban dwellers lived in slums. This is a decrease in percentage terms from nearly 50% of urban dwellers living in slums in 1990. But due to rapid urbanization in the region, the number of people living in slums has not fallen. These people do not have access to at least one of the following basic necessities, that is security of tenure, structural quality and durability of dwelling, access to safe water, access to sanitation facilities, and sufficient living area. This problem is particularly acute in low-income economies in the region, where nearly two-thirds of urban dwellers live in slums, and particularly in Cambodia and Lao People's Democratic Republic, where the figure is closer to 4/5. The third issue is that of urban environment and climate change. In their quest for economic growth, most of the developing economies do not pay sufficient attention to urban environments and climate change issues. In most of the developing regions, especially Asia, the average ecological footprint is in excess of 5 hectares per head, which suggests that current consumption patterns are unsustainable. Climate change worsens the negative aspects of urbanization. Enormous damage may occur when the scope and intensity of abnormal weather conditions exceed the capacity of urban infrastructure. For example, rainwater drainage channels to prevent flood, which was built based on previous disasters at risks. Since economically and socially vulnerable people tend to live in areas that are vulnerable to natural disasters, they are likely to be more seriously affected by the adverse effects of climate change. A study by Japan International Cooperation Agency, that is JICA, in 2013 has shown that out of the total disasters faced by the cities in the world, the share of climate-related disasters have grown tremendously, and it has gained its momentum, especially in the 21st century. We can see that even the incidents of earthquake, volcanoes, and dry mass movements have increased, especially after 1990s. But the spurt in climate-related disasters took place much earlier, and the rise is noticeable after 2000s. The urban growth in developing countries is not found to be environmentally sustainable. Existing infrastructure development and growth patterns may lock these economies into unsustainable consumption and production models for years to come. For example, air pollution in Asia causes as many as 5,19,000 premature deaths every year. Water supplies and food security are becoming a critical challenge in urban areas of many developing economies, and the poor are most vulnerable to climate change. The environmental risks facing cities of the developing countries are related to three major issues. These are poverty, industrial production modes, that is air and water pollution, and increasing consumption that is higher carbon dioxide emissions, water pollution, and land degradation. Bai and Imura have put these risks in perspective under the form of a model of urban environmental evolution. They propose a four-stage process in the development of urban environmental issues in relation to economic growth. In figure, the stage 1 of the development cycle is characterized by poverty. It involves issues like demographic growth and migration to cities, high informal sector employment, lack of safe drinking water, and inadequate sanitation. In stage 2, industrial pollution related issues arise as a result of the urban concentration of particulate matter and or sulfur dioxide. Stage 3 is dominated by consumption related issues such as urban waste and increasing carbon dioxide emissions per head. Stage 4 involves a shift towards what has become to be known as an eco-city, with a focus on sustainability. In other words, in the final stage, cities reduce the use of non-renewable resources and adapt to climate change. Virtually, very few of the cities in developing countries have effectively overcome stage 3 issues. None have reached the eco-city stage and embarked on truly sustainable pathways, even though some early signs of such progress are emerging in Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and some Japanese cities. This is a most welcome development since it is essential for the sustainability of Asian cities. Since many of the cities in developing countries are living in stage 2 or stage 3, they are facing acute problems of clean air, drinking water, carbon dioxide emissions, and land degradation, which has turned the urban growth miserable for most of the urban residents, which harms the livability in urban areas. Now let us discuss about the livability in urban areas. The Economic Intelligence Unit runs an annual survey of 215 cities worldwide that provides a global ranking of the most livable based on 39 criteria, ranging from personal safety to the quality of public transportation. Livability indicators can provide useful measures of the quality of life in urban environments. The notion refers not only to economic and social well-being, but also to the quality of the environment and especially environmental services. Among a few Asian cities, Singapore, 9 cities in Japan, Kuala Lumpur, Taipei, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, China come top in the region. But none of these Asian cities features in the top 30 worldwide. All offer good living standards. Chinese cities have become more livable in recent years due to massive capital expenditure on public amenities and increased availability of consumer goods. Less developed cities, especially those where the threat of unrest or terrorism is an issue, fare much worse, with Vietnam, Karachi, and Lahore ranking in the lowest livability categories. New Delhi is at 148th rank among 215 cities. Mumbai, Bangalore, and Chennai are respectively at 151st, 153rd, and 159th place. Thus, Indian cities have much lower livability index value as compared to other Asian cities. So students, let us summarize what we have learned from this module. We have observed that the world is rapidly urbanizing itself, and the growth of urbanization is much higher in the developing countries than the developed ones. The cities from the emerging economies are expected to increase their contributions in GDP in next 15 to 20 years. However, with better prospects of urban growth, the cities in the developing countries also suffer from poverty, inequality, and poor living conditions, which are further aggravated by the environmental issues in the developing country cities. To solve these issues and make the urban growth sustainable, massive investments in basic services is needed to improve the air and water quality, health facilities, sanitation, etc. Alternative methods should be found and implemented for efficient use of energy and other scarce natural resources. In short, if the urban development in the developing countries is to become more sustainable, governments and communities must give priority to better urban planning and management of urban development, improvements to environmental management, and better environmental governance on a region-wide scale. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.